Hello, my name is Jānis Sārts, and I'm here to moderate the session on COVID-19 consequences for defense. COVID-19, a word that was not invented just a year ago. Now, it is one of these words that everybody knows all around the globe, that dominates a lot of our daily lives, that has made many people to change their daily routines, that has made governments to change the way they operate, that has led us to the unprecedented measures, lockdowns, to make as much as possible the slow of the spread of the virus possible. In these circumstances, unlike in a usual crisis, at the first lines of defense, we have doctors, nurses, and the medical personnel. But of course, because the crisis has been so big and vast and global, defense systems have been called upon to help. And of course, they've responded, because these are the systems in the national governments that are trained for crisis. They are trained for helping people. They're trained to keep their national security tight and intact. And this time around, we have seen they respond. Also, COVID-19 has made new dynamics on a global scale on the national security and international security. The COVID-19 has fostered some of the new dynamics in this new era: digitalization of the nations, increasing the vulnerability, rise of certain actors on a global scale, by certain actors using the opportunity to gain influence, and increased number of conflicts that we've seen grow during 2020. In this neighborhood, of course, we talk a lot about the Belarus, we talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, but many other crises are happening as we speak. And there are certainly a link, if not one, then probably more, with the effect of the COVID-19. And this is the subject of today's talk that we will have with a very distinguished panel, expert panel, if I may say so, that could really reflect from their practical everyday experiences of what COVID-19 means for the defense. And we will have during this panel Minister of Defense of Latvia and Deputy Prime Minister Dr. Artis Pabriks. We will have Harjit Sajjan, Minister of Defense of Canada. We'll have Ben Wallace, Secretary of State for Defense of the United Kingdom, and Jüri Luik, Minister of Defense in Estonia. And now, if I may, we'll start with Artis. It's been an interesting year, hasn't it?
Well, it's not over yet.
Well, we wish it is, but it hasn't stopped yet. So what has been your takeaways? How defense had to adapt to this new reality? In a way, as I've said, defense was not supposed to be the first responder, but obviously there was a way that defense had to respond. And if you think about it also, what do you think were the larger implications for the European and transatlantic security we see right now unfold as a kind of consequence of COVID-19 pandemic taking shape globally?
Well, there's a bunch of questions actually what we can speak now about through the prism of COVID-19. But before I touch upon them, I simply wanted to say hello once more to my dear colleagues. Thank you for being with us here in Riga, even if it is not on place here. And Harjit, I mean, thank you for your colors behind you and on your head. And I don't believe that you can be vigilant at 1 o'clock in the night without Canadian or Scotch whiskey. I don't know how it happens. But dear friends, and this question about COVID impact, I think it has multiple phases. First of all, it really made us think in a practical manners, in a real battlefield, what works and what doesn't work. Because COVID-19 in some way was a test which we were not planning. And test for all types of responses to crisis, not only in a military, but also in many other sectors. If I have to speak now about military, I would like to probably distinguish two levels. One level, which is our national level, the Latvian level, and other is an international level, because here, of course, COVID-19 overlaps with a number of other challenges which were not abolished, because once we speak now about COVID-19, we have to remember that, first of all, nobody abolished other diseases, and secondly, nobody abolished other security challenges what we are facing daily. And we have to see this all the time in parallel way. Now, about national response, first of all, we understood that our traditional way of thinking for the last decades about globalization, where we always have been following the path that it's a global village, we can invest where it gives more profit, to buy where it is cheaper, and it has not to be our nation state or even not European region or transatlantic area, but we can go to Asia, to China or somewhere else. It doesn't work. Because suddenly, when we all needed these personal equipments to safeguard our health, then suddenly we discovered there are no factories, there are no deliverances, there are no prices. We had to buy it, for instance, from China, which were not selling to us. One of our, or not only one, but number of our partners in European Union, where we have an open market, common market, open borders, we're suddenly telling, look, wait, we will first provide ourselves and then we will give it to you. And imagine a situation where we are in the war, when our country's borders are challenged, where we are a border not only of our nation state, but we are a border of EU and NATO. What would happen in this case? So, the very simple decision what we have been making, and I have been making here, is I was asking to government and our enterprises, what is about oil reserves? Because in our European Union standards, we need to have oil reserves for 3 months, but most of the countries actually do not have these oil reserves in their national territory. They are keeping it somewhere else. And if the crisis comes, you will never get to these oil reserves. So it's simply a business for somebody, but this is not really thinking strategically. Secondly, what about food reserves? If something happens, you know, on the one hand, we can buy cheaper tomatoes as Latvians in Poland or Spain or Netherlands or somewhere else. But what if we have to provide our troops and our allies, which are stationed here, with the food for 1 or 2 months? Where we will buy it? For what prices we will buy it? Of course, all the equipment what we need for COVID-19 pandemic was suddenly, we discovered as a surprise that in order to get face masks or respirators, we need to wait for 3 or 4 months. It's impossible. It doesn't work. And for me, it reminded the situation where Latvian government was in early September 1939, because as a former historian, I was reading documents of our cabinet of ministers in those days, and they have been counting one by one what kind of reserves do they have after Kattegat and Skategat is closed by the German Navy, by Nazi Navy, what kind of situation we face economically in those days, and what kind of offers could give us at those days Soviet Union in exchange to place their troops in our country. So these are just small nuances. Now, globally, of course, apart of pandemic COVID-19, we can speak about our transatlantic relationship with, between Europe and United States. We can speak here about Turkey, and maybe I will not be extremely popular, but I would say if we are speaking to traditional challenges, for instance, what is happening now in a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in a context with Libya and with Syria, then I would like to challenge or put a hypothesis here that no matter what different political forces and countries think about Turkey or some other issues around Turkey, the Turkish position in all three places was the one where they could challenge the growing Russian dominance. Nobody else could do this, neither Europeans nor Americans. Turkey could do this. Maybe there is also something what we can learn from this attitude. I will stop now.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Pabriks, and I think you painted a pretty stark picture of the reality, and I think there are quite a lot of people that would agree with you that it's really not very promising, the picture we're seeing right now. I would rather say probably on the solidarity test that you've painted out in the early phases of a pandemic, that we've actually learned to start to be able to be solidar, to keep the solidarity in these times. So I hope there's a lesson already identified that this initial nationalization of assets and approaches, we have learned that it's better to be solidar. Let's now turn over to Canada, and Minister Sajjan, thank you really very much for joining us, and we really appreciate you taking your time during your night's sleep to join our conference. You just heard Dr. Pabriks painted a very disturbing picture, I would say, how the systems that we've built have not really, at least in initial stage, responded as well as we should have expected or hoped. Do you see the same from Canadian perspective, or you have a bit more of an upbeat in the way the Canadian society, defense in Canada, as well as how you see the international community responded?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this conference, and thank you for hosting. To my colleagues, it's great to see you, even though it's virtual. And I dressed like this because Latvians have always been wonderful hosts to me, so it's the least I could do. So thank you very much for this. And, you know, COVID, I think it has challenged everyone, every nation, and this is a global crisis that we all have to deal with together, and we all have to come through it together if all of us want to be safe. And the challenges that Artis talked about are absolutely real. But I will also offer up in terms of a lot of the work that we've done at NATO, building our own resilience as we look at to strengthen NATO, I think has helped us in our individual countries to be prepared a little bit better. Sure, in terms of COVID, it has come as a surprise, but what this has allowed us to do is look at what type of national resilience is needed so that you can be supportive of one another. And because of the tremendous relationship that we have built together, I think all of us were on the phones with each other, learning from one another. What are the things that we can do? And for example, from a Canadian perspective, it allowed us to look at how can defense support the whole of government support efforts against COVID. And we built the military response based on what we were learning from our colleagues in Italy, in Spain. And as we saw the wave kind of shifting, that allowed us to kind of look at what type of forces are needed. And it helped us, I think, prevent the significant blow of COVID. We had Canadian Armed Forces members in long-term care facilities. I mean, our soldiers aren't not trained for that, but they responded and they did wonderful work. And so what this will allow us to do is look at the lesson on what type of resiliency we need to all build in our own nation so we can be supportive to one another. But at the same time, I think even I've heard about within Europe, NATO allies supporting one another with whether it's providing expert advice to medics, to PPE support from a Canadian perspective across the ocean. We provided tactical airlift, what we called Operation Globe, for moving supplies, providing money to the global initiative to fight COVID as well. But as we did this, I think because of the resiliency and the work that we have done at NATO together, allowed us to get a grip of this threat within our own countries. Granted, it hasn't gone away, and granted, it has challenged countries in a different way. But it also allowed us to make sure that we can sustain our international operations. As Artis had mentioned, the threats did not go away. In fact, actually, they increased. Some of our adversaries have actually increased the threats to us, whether it's disinformation or on the cyber side or conflicts increasing. We needed to do our part, and we responded. So, I see a little bit of hope in terms of this, that this is going to actually make us a lot stronger. And I mean this sincerely, because it allowed us to test our own abilities. And as we look at moving forward now, as every nation is going to have a deficit budget challenge, we also have to realize that this is not, when we spend on defense, it's not just strictly about our own security. This is about our collective security, something that NATO obviously represents. But if you want to talk about our economy, the defense investments that we make also is part of the economic stimulus as well. For example, just in Canada alone, the defense sector employs over 283,000 people across Canada. 15.2 billion is added to our GDP every single year. So when you put all this together and we look at the stresses on the budget, defense has played a very important role and will continue to play a very important role as we move forward.
Thank you, Minister Sajjan. And I think you struck the note that is very important, that in the crisis, friendships matter. And that were the ties that we all were able to rely on when the really unprecedented situations that we faced, and that these ties and friendships that we fostered because of NATO, our previous operations, and etc., have really helped us to respond in the best way possible given the circumstances. The other 2 points that I think are really adequate is the agility to adapt and respond. And I think that's where we see the defense have been really performing well across the alliance in ability quickly to shift from what was their traditional role onto something that is really required. That's something that we've not been training too much for. So I think that's the added value we've seen from the defense. Now, turning over to Secretary Wallace, you have one of the highest rates of infection, at least recently, in Europe, and which probably is quite understandable given the population density. Has it been a significant strain on your ability to perform the usual defense system duties? And were you able to withstand these pressures and also help the general government effort to fight the COVID crisis?
Well, no, thank you. And just to say, I'm delighted to join my colleagues. I wish we were all together in Riga doing this for real, face to face. And but there will be another time. And I miss you all anyhow. But it would be good to do it again. Look, so for COVID for us goes to the heart of what I think some of the other contributors have said. You know, the armed forces are about resilience. You know, resilience is our middle name. It's other government departments that are not used to resilience in the same way, and they're not used to moving at pace or speed when it comes to challenges. So we, in one sense, without too much trouble, managed to thicken up and assist many of the other government departments, whether it was health or whether it was logistics or Department of Transport, etc., and just make sure that we enabled them to try and match the speed of this awful disease's spread. And again, because resilience is part of what we all do, thinking about the J5, the next step. What are we going to do next? That's what we're doing right now. Will there be a third wave? Will there be a fourth wave? Will there be a mutation coming from Denmark? All that sort of challenges. And that is, in our DNA as defence. All of our defence ministries think like that. And so the response was quite straightforward. It was learning as we go. But we brought to bear everything from our defence intelligence analyst capability to our logistics and to the mass of sort of the ordinary infantry soldier who is right now, for example, mass testing the city of Liverpool. About 3,000 soldiers are doing that. So it wasn't the big challenge. I think, for what it's worth, the big challenge is what comes next. The big challenge is sustaining our response. We managed to continue all our other defense tasks, whether that's Op-Shader in Syria and Iraq, and continue to take the fight to ISIS. We managed to deploy with the US squadron our Queen Elizabeth class carrier in the build-up for next year's sail to the other side of the world, hopefully. And we managed to do all our counter-terrorism and other tasks. And air policing in the Baltics. We had a Type 23 frigate. And we managed to still pursue Russian submarines around the North Atlantic. So all of that was possible, but resilience and sustainability is always a test. So what we're doing now, and I think it's really important, is to, a bit like the title of this session, what are the consequences? And by that, for us, we are in the long-term game, and the consequences for me about COVID are really in 3 or 4 areas. One is, I think the world is going to be more unstable and more anxious. And that should be a worry from us from a security point of view. Lots of people have been indoors, locked down, dependent on social media, governments all doing things that are unpopular. And that allows our adversaries to exploit both misinformation, spread division, and cause worry. Economically depressed world. I don't think anyone pretends this is not damaging many of us. And we know that poor economies often link to conflict afterwards, and a more divided world. So I think that's something that we're going to have to think about and make sure that we catch up with our adversaries, both in development and investment. And remember, our adversaries through this are often ones who have little regards for their voters, if they have voters at all, or indeed for the welfare. And so they are, I think, seizing strategic advantage because they don't have to juggle healthcare budgets and local government budgets and getting businesses back up and running in the same way. They are busy investing and being active even at the expense of their populations. And I think that's something that we need to catch up on. So I'll just finish by saying, for me, the consequences are going to be a political debate in many of our countries in the West, reminding them that defense provides resilience and reminding them that we are as important as those competing healthcare budgets, economic budgets that our politicians, who very often, and I'm included, are more short-term than long-term because they deal with the voters' needs here and now. And that means that there will be definitely a sense of a tension between our internally and all our governments about getting defence the right slice of the cake, because those points I said earlier are going to come and haunt us if we don't make sure we invest now.
Thank you, Secretary Wallace. You quite rightly point us to what is going to happen next, and I think we have to really start very hard to think about these consequences in a number of ways. First, as you mentioned, the world becomes more unstable, but also that there is going to be the fight for the resources within our own systems, and as we all know, all countries have gone up in their deficit levels and etc., etc. Measures will have to be taken. And there will be consequences in that, and we have to recognize that defense will have to play an important role also in the future. I think that's a very, very valid point. Now, Minister Luik, you've been probably recently one of the envies of the Europe, not seeing that much of a intensity of COVID cases, but as we here in Latvia know, that can change very, very quickly. So what have been your take on integrating the defense to the response of the government, as well as probably also, do you agree with Secretary Wallace on the fact that once we emerge from that, it will be a much more unstable world.
Hello to everybody, and thank you very much for including me to this distinguished panel. It would really be great to see all of you colleagues and to be in Riga, but that's how life is nowadays. So even the ability of having this kind of conference is I think great. Let me say that, of course, the whole COVID epidemic was a real shock to everybody. And the initial moves by several states, especially in closing the borders and limiting the movements, sort of planting the flag of we want the personal protection equipment and we won't give it to others, etc., etc. That was, of course, a very negative sign, also from the community of values which we represent, because we are supposed to be countries who can work together and be united in times of crisis. So I'm very happy that we have managed to restore a lot of this cooperation nowadays. And as was pointed out, both in NATO and in the European Union, there is now a lot of thinking and work and restructuring so that we are now in the autumn already much more ready to support each other. And I think this is a very, very important achievement. Now, when it comes to the particular Estonian case, then of course, we departed from two principles. One, the conventional risks have not disappeared. I mean, let's be honest, Russia is still where it is. Russian intentions are still what they were. Russia has not been changed by COVID in political terms, at least. So the armed forces should guarantee the readiness to react at moment's notice, because that's our primary task. But the other task was, of course, to use the armed forces as much as possible in responding to the civilian crisis which we were facing. For me, it was very important not to sort of hide the armed forces behind the high wall and say, look, we are here only for when the shooting starts. And otherwise, it's a wholly civilian enterprise. On the contrary, we put everything to the table. Our field hospitals, our specialists of various sorts, everything. Whatever was necessary, we provided it. What was particularly interesting was that a lot of things which the civilian agencies needed was our planning expertise. Really, the officers from the staffs who were expert planners, the Minister of Health actually asked for them to come and to provide their expertise in how to plan a response. So the similarity between the civilian and military crisis planning actually came through very well during this crisis. We are also very happy that we managed to provide to our own forces and to the EFP forces in Estonia adequate protection and a situation where we avoided a major health crisis related to the personnel of the military. And we also managed, which I think was very important, to continue to conduct military exercises. We had a number of, actually, some of them quite major exercises in spring to maintain the defense readiness, because, as I said, that is extremely important. What comes in the future, I agree with Ben and others that there is a lot of unpredictability But what we have to maintain is first, unity of purpose, and second, quickly restructure our common organizations so that they are able to provide assistance in this situation. For instance, NATO. I mean, there is a legitimate question: what can NATO actually do in health crisis? We shouldn't overplay this and say that NATO is the first responder. It's clearly not. So I think we have to be very creative and think very precisely what is the added value which NATO as an organization which with major resources could provide, strategic transport, or what have you. So I think that's extremely important. We don't know what happens, but if we maintain our unity, we'll be ready. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister Luik. And if I may drill a little bit more on the question of the consequence post-COVID, actually for all the panelists. What do you think once the, hopefully, COVID situation gets under the control, vaccine arrives, people vaccinate, which I think will be still a big disinformation fight to be had over these issues. What do you think will be, at that moment, the two key security challenges as this instability will further, as you all argued, unfold? And what are the two things that we have to keep our eye on, both as nations, individually, as well as NATO? Minister Luik?
I firmly believe, and perhaps I'm not capable of thinking outside the box or pushing the envelope. I firmly believe that many of the quote-unquote old threats will remain. I mean, perhaps there are a number of new tools which our adversaries can use. And some of them are really related to cyber, are related to propaganda efforts. As Ben said, people are now much more reliant on computer networks. So everything bad which an adversary can sort of bring to the table, I'm sure they will in one or the other way. And of course, there are major challenges with Russia, which is particularly crucial and complicated for the Baltic states. There's no doubt that China is a big challenge, and we probably still haven't designed a way to respond to these challenges, which the Chinese sort of increased strength is providing. But I think we should also look very carefully into what the scientists are saying. They are saying that because of the global warming, and particularly because of the trade with live animals, which is unfortunately going on everywhere, particularly in Asia, the risks of another pandemic, of another illness spreading throughout the world are very real. So I think we also have to drill down to ask ourselves, what can we do to avoid other epidemiological crisis like we are facing today. Here we have to be very, very creative, very precise, and invest a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Now over to Secretary Wallace. So would you agree with Minister Luik that we're basically still going to face the same adversaries, but just with the new tool sets?
Yeah, I mean, I think the adversaries have had a number of things. I think the adversaries, probably feel that their view of sub-threshold sort of constant attacks rated for them. And I think that means they have set the wind direction that we're all going to have to think about tackling, both as NATO, but also in a sort of common values group of people, whether that's for us, the Five Eyes, or indeed the Northern Group and the Joint Expeditionary Force countries in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries, because, it's definitely where they are competing. I think they're going to put more effort into it. And I think that's why we're going to have to examine during this crisis what we can do more to counter in the threshold. I think what also is going to be the sort of aftertaste of this is that global competition is now very much more than just trade. It's going to be trade, it's going to be the narrative, it's going to be mutual aid, it's going to be fighting over resource. And, as we've seen at the softer end, I mean, if we think of the examples of some countries in Europe not living up to those ideals of sharing equal partners or being, making sure that they live up to their values rather than put themselves first. Magnify that elsewhere in the world. Magnify sort of a growth of nationalism with borders, and I think we're going to see more of that. And Britain as a sort of standard bearer for free trade will do its very best to make sure that doesn't happen. I think that damages us all, certainly in the economies that we have. So I think that is going to be one of the next challenges. But with these type of things are going to be here to stay, I think. Whether it's COVID-19, we could have all been here a few years ago with SARS. It just never really reached it. But as far as I'm aware, there isn't really a cure for SARS at the moment, and it just didn't spread the same way. So these things are, I think, a fact in a multi-connected, open trading world. I think the points about trading animals, etc., are fair, and we have to think about that. But I think we also have to think about what's fair play, what are the rules. I would say of China that there's lots of speculation about where this started and how it started in China. But it's how you respond to these things that are as important. Are you open to an international investigation and learning lessons, not for the sake of blame, but for the sake of so it doesn't happen again? That's the fundamental reason we do these things. If you're not open to that, when Australia called for an open investigation, if you were then described by mouthpieces of the Chinese government as gum on the bottom of the shoe for daring to have the temerity to suggest an inquiry, then we should be deeply worried about China's attitude to being a global partner for all of us. So I think that's the other area that I think is one of our big challenges.
Well, thank you very much. I think good points. Now over to Minister Sajjan. Secretary Wallace just raised the issue of China and also pointed the importance of narrative. And of course, from the perspective we're having right now, China is one of the big countries that now under what we call the second wave circumstances have been able to actually manage that. Question was the right means or weren't the means too drastic, but they've been able to manage the pandemic. So doesn't it add to their narrative and then therefore to their position into the world, into the global affairs, and also have an angle of a security aspect, especially I think quite important to Canada. What is your perspective on that, Minister?
Well, first of all, I mean, I don't think it adds to any positivity to the narrative based on how they're dealing with COVID. I think the points that Ben has raised are very important ones. This is about learning about what happened. This is about making sure we have the appropriate answers so we can actually be prepared as a global society so we can prevent anything like this happening. Think about it this way. COVID right now is a horrifying disease that is impacting the world. Now, when all of us were thinking about threats, they have the conventional threats. I think in the militaries, we always look at health pandemics as, are we prepared for it? But the question is always, well, what's the likelihood, right? Well, the likelihood has now become a reality with COVID. Now we need to think about what could be the next likelihood that can become a reality. Imagine if the death rate is even higher with the next peak. So we need to be very mindful of how we prepare, but more importantly, how do we prevent the next health pandemic from taking place? We had SARS. Now we've had some COVID. We've had even impact Ebola in Africa. We need to be very mindful of what we do now and how do we prevent this, because things could actually be a lot worse regardless of the resiliency that we actually build in our societies. And if nations are not willing to open up to for the type of questions that every nation around the world is asking, then we have some significant concerns there. And I think when it comes to China, transparency is not just about delivering PPE to the rest of the world. It's about making sure we figure out what actually happened and how do we prevent it in the first place. And then at the same time, we need to be mindful how with the disinformation campaigns that have been taking place by both China and by Russia. So we have to, I think, all of us as a global community come together and deal with COVID, but we need to have some very direct conversations and come together, I think, collectively as allies, or as NATO, as the multilateral organizations that we have, but ultimately as the world come together and to have those questions answered. And that's the biggest issue, because we have issues of, we have challenges of climate change that's going to impact us, what's happening in the Arctic. But then we also have the traditional security threats that we deal on a regular basis where we need to deter. We have North Korea. We have unconventional things that can pop up like ISIS as well. So we have the increased threats that are increasing around the world that we need to be very mindful of. And if we're not ready to deal with those and deter those, how are we going to be dealing with any other future health pandemics? So we need to work together to try to prevent it in the first place.
Well, thank you, Minister. I think you bring up a very valid point that this is a global issue. Everybody has been affected and will be affected by the virus. So there should have been no brainer to have a good cooperation at a global scale to fight with that virus. But what we've seen in reality hasn't been quite the same. We might have a straight and direct talks in between the allies and the friends, but at a global level, I think we've more or less failed the test. At least that's my judgment. And I wouldn't say that's the best of the news for the next pandemic. Hopefully we learn lessons, or for the global warming, because we've seen in a real crisis, many nations take a very national approach and look for their gains instead of international gains. Hopefully we take lesson from that. Dr. Pabriks, well, your colleagues have seen a very different angles of what is to come, I wouldn't say after COVID, but once we've got this situation of under the control. What's your take?
Well, I would probably return to your first initial question, what you asked to Jüri, because afterwards the things developed. And as I see this question, it is about what COVID-19 triggered additionally as a security challenges to the world and to our nations. And I'm not mentioning here all the traditional aspects, those challenges what we do have, either it is our transatlantic relationship, or it is China, or it is issues with Taiwan or other things. But if I have to distinguish what additionally comes triggered by COVID-19 to already existing situation, I would say it is worsening those challenges what we already had here, but which were maybe not so much obvious from the first glance. And I think that one of the most challenging things will be additional wave of disinformation, because we see how people are misled by different objectives and ideas. How do we fight COVID-19? Do we need masks, for instance? Do we go in demonstrations? Are we facing a world kind of conspiracy with something? So disinformation will increase. And secondly, what is really also worrying me within this network of disinformation is the capability of societies to remain resilient and to remain stable, because there have been already a number of other aspects, technological revolutions, cyber issues, etc., which have been forcing us more and more to live in bubbles. This fragmentation will increase. On top of that, with this disinformation, with challenges to traditional rules of law, to traditional value systems. And here I have to reflect also what Ben was telling. I'm afraid we do not have a complete toolbox for this. And that will be the largest problem.
Well, I think you really raised a valid point that the risks post-pandemic or post kind of getting control over the pandemic will be not only external, they will be also internal, society-wise. The ability of a society to function as a group rather than a number of very distinctive groups that disagree most of the time.
Very respectable groups, of course.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that has been an interesting and insightful discussion so far. Now it's the moment to bring in the questions from the audience. We have already a few. So I'll read them out and I will point them to the people that they've addressed to, or if they're not, I will address that to one of the speakers. First, okay, I'll start with a different one. I'll leave this one for the end. To Minister Luik, there's a question that, well, we've all learned that to respond to the pandemic, the comprehensive response of a society is important, that all elements of security count, etc., etc. Isn't there a point to adapt the NATO 2% definition to cater for more of those needs or other aspects of security to be counted under the 2%? I suspect I know what you're going to say, but I think it's worth to say it out loud.
Yes, well, you know what I'm going to say, and you are right. My response is we shouldn't. I believe that the NATO's definition of military expenditure is very precise, and it actually speaks about military capabilities, something we need to wage a war, something where military, in a military conflict, we need particular capabilities. But of course, I think it is important to keep in mind that many of these assets have dual use. I mean, for instance, let's take the hospitals. I mean, you have a brigade, it needs, let's say, a Role 2 hospital. It can easily be used in the peacetime as an ordinary civilian hospital supporting the capacity of the existing civilian hospitals. There are a lot of other examples like that. I mean, tens and tens of examples. Military has enormous logistical capabilities, usually for warfighting reasons, but they can easily be used in other instances as well. Preferably, we can raise the budget of, let's say, the ministers of interior, or it depends on a country which ministry is dealing with civilian contingencies, civilian risks. But I don't think we should do it in the expense of NATO's definition of military expenditure, because the idea actually is, when people propose that, the idea is to spend less on military creating real combat capabilities. And that's kind of a cover, a nice cover for that kind of approach. So long story short, my answer is no, we shouldn't change the definition.
Well, I think all of the colleagues around this virtual table would agree absolutely to that response. Thank you. Now the next question I will direct at Secretary Wallace, and that's relating to cyber. Cyber is becoming increasingly the priority and one of the weak links that the societies have. And obviously COVID-19, digitalization have increased the pace of the cyber exposure of the societies. And also the incoming 5G technologies are opening up new venues of the way cyber can be used for malicious activity. And the question is, how can the transatlantic alliance do more to bolster cyber capability, cybersecurity capability, I think?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think your analysis is right on cyber, but I think we shouldn't forget it's not a either or. So our adversaries are investing in cyber, but they're not particularly disinvesting in more traditional offensive capabilities. And that's why the first solution is, I think, as in a sense you allude to in your question, is burden sharing. You know, that if we are to make ourselves a harder target for cyber actors, whether that's disinformation or cybercrime or indeed just espionage, we need to make sure that we share that burden across all of our government functions and with our partners. So the transatlantic relationship absolutely has a role to play, because so many of our services and indeed, you know, search engines, Google, Amazon, all these things, while they may have regional or national bases elsewhere, Microsoft, etc., is very key to delivering many of these things. And therefore, making sure that cybersecurity in the United States, it's in our interest that they are as well defended as they can be, and that it's in their interest that we too are as safe from those that would corrupt either their products or indeed their policies. So I think we do in the United Kingdom work very hard with the Five Eyes, the national security, the NSA and GCHQ are sort of bosom pals, work incredibly closely, as are a number of other nations. And also we take the view that on cyber, we work very closely into Europe as well. The security of Europe, irrespective of Brexit, is incredibly important to Britain. And I know that GCHQ and our National Cybersecurity Centre, which really came online about 18 months, 2 years ago, work incredibly closely at both spreading the knowledge of threats and indeed mitigations. And it's going to be about burden share, because our adversaries find it harder to penetrate our ministries of defence, but find it quite easier to penetrate government services such as, I don't know, pensions or health in our system with the WannaCry attack, healthcare systems. And we have a role, again, a bit like the resilience role in COVID, to spreading the message and spreading the word about how to have good cyber hygiene and what steps you need to do to make sure you're safe.
Well, I think you, Minister, mentioned quite rightly how much we have and focus on the typical cyber defense, cyber security. I would point out also that in the extended view of cyber world, unfortunately, the companies that have been, the Western companies, have been very weak on pushing back the manipulation of their digital services online, namely Facebook, YouTube, and others. They're all up for buying, you can buy the manipulation of these networks as we speak with ease and very cheaply. And that strikes me that when we are especially now facing this time when the COVID-19 vaccine disinformation campaign is going to be one of the biggest challenges, they are there, not protected, and they're our own Western systems. So I think there is more to be done, but of course that's biased view from Stratcom Center of Excellence. Now for the next question to Dr. Pabriks and Minister Sajjan, an interesting one. Does changing leadership in the United States give room for more transatlantic cooperation? I'll start with Minister Sajjan.
I think I think because we're closer neighbors, maybe that's why. But I think first of all is that the relationship that all of us have with the U.S., especially with NATO, is rock solid. We saw that from President Obama's administration, even to President Trump, even with some of the sometimes some of the challenging information that was coming out. NATO remained, the support that we got from the U.S. was always strong. What the message that every nation was already talking about was burden sharing and making sure that every nation spent on key capabilities so they could actually provide the appropriate support for NATO. So that relationship, I think, is going to continue. And I think moving on to with President Biden's administration, that won't change. I think it'll continue to provide greater support. I think that what you'll see is the message will remain the same, but also the support of the transatlantic bond will remain extremely strong, just as it is for Canada. We value that relationship. I mean, they're our closest partner, but collectively, even though we look at North American security and continental defense, we look at that as how it contributes to a NATO defense and deterrence message. And as we were talking about cyber, we're already thinking about everything that we do, whether it's supporting cyber capabilities within our own Canadian society. We're also looking at what type of capabilities that are needed in the new capabilities that we're building, whether the investments that we're making in space, the new ships that we're building together with Australia and the UK, but how it's going to work collectively with NATO. So the support and the relationship that we have with the US is absolutely critical. And I think it will always remain very strong, regardless of the administration that's going to be in the US.
Thank you, Minister. And now the view from Latvia.
Well, as you know, transatlantic relationship for Latvia is now very much bound to two countries. And changing leadership in United States, I don't see how it could more give space or improve already existing great relationship between Canada and Latvia. So in that sense, I think it is really fulfilled, and the only thing I could wish is that Harjit could sit here. But otherwise, I think it's a great thing. And I should tell also to Harjit, thank you very much. 2 days ago, we have been celebrating our National Day in our cemetery, remembering our warriors of independence war in 1919 November. And there have been also a brief speech of your military chaplain who actually announced that Canadians are here ready to give their lives for our common freedom and independence. And so are we, Latvians, ready to do it for Canada. So on this bilateral issue, I think we are on a great stance. Thanks to this EFP group and thanks to unfortunately, Russian invasion to Ukraine, which opened eyes to many of us. Now, as far as transatlantic relationship and Latvia and US, I would say that our bilateral relationship during the Trump administration was actually very good, because we received all that support, almost all that support what we were asking for, and that was a great cooperation. I also should agree with Harjit that changing of administration would not change our attitudes. It simply would give maybe some kind of a new impetus, because of course new people will come into offices and we would have to deal with the different people. But I also should kind of little bit warn those minds in other countries in Europe who now think that by changing administration they would be capable to lie back and relax a little bit in their armchairs. Either it is because there will be no questions about 2% or more for defense or other things. No way. There is no way back. You can't step back anymore in that water which passed already in the river. These are different times. These are already different challenges. And I really would like to see that our friends in Europe are really not thinking within the question which was given to Jüri, that, we will now count within 2% everything which we are giving, for our transportation or hospitals or something else, just to stay calm and not to invest in the military. These times are over. So I'm looking forward for new faces, but I'm also looking forward for the same good old friendship which we enjoyed with the United States, because without United States there will be no security and stability in Europe in future.
And what I also would add to that is for people the advice to look beyond the emotions of the newsfeed we're having. Look at the data that's beneath, and that's, I think, important in this environment that we have. Now, as our time slowly starts to approach an end, I'd like to do the final round with the question on what should be the lessons learned that we take away from this crisis. I would say 3 or 4 key lessons learned that we take. I'll start with Minister Pabriks.
Okay. Well, I don't know about 3 and 4, but I would say one important lesson is never take everything for granted, because stability tomorrow is stability today is instability tomorrow. We have to stay vigilant. And the challenges and opponents, either these are human opponents or they are artificial opponents, starting with artificial intelligence and ending with diseases, they are frequently one step ahead of us. So the toolbox always is half full. We have to think how to fill in this toolbox, and we have to do this together, because separately we cannot prevail. Even United States can't prevail alone. And this is the most important thing what we have to keep in mind. Be vigilant.
Thank you, Minister Pabriks. Minister Sajjan, what's your key takeaways and lessons?
I think as we talk about resiliency, I think it's extremely important how we build mutually supporting resiliency. Look at the strengths that we have in our nations, and as we look at our supply chain, how can we be mutually supporting? So we're not getting into the situation that we got when we first started with COVID. So I think that's going to be very important, not relying on a single source of supply chain management. We need to look internally at how we look at NATO allies, to how can we be mutually supporting. So that way, the instability that might surprise us in the future, that we will be much better prepared if we do have that mutually supporting resiliency.
Thank you. But if you would have to predict the next crisis, what would it be?
Oh boy, if I could. I've always said actually earlier that the health pandemics were the ones that actually scared me the most. And my bigger concern right now, as we talk about climate, how serious of a concern that is, a health pandemic where the death rate is so high that we're not able to manage things fast enough. That's why it's so important for us to look at the lessons of COVID now and how do we prevent a health pandemic that could be much worse.
Thank you for your points. Now over to Secretary Wallace. What are your key takeaways and lessons learned?
I think I'll try and keep it short, 2. You only get the resilience you pay for. And there is a European sort of fairy tale, I think we were all taught, called the Pied Piper of Hamlin. I don't know if you know, we were taught it in Britain, which is a German story about a magical piper who saves a town from rats and takes them off. And when he comes to be paid by the Burgermeister says, well, we didn't really need you anyhow, and I'm not paying. And if you don't pay for your resilience, when this happens again, there won't be as many people around to protect you. I think secondly, our adversaries won't wait. We are now going to, in the West, preoccupy ourselves about rebuilding our health services, paying off our deficits, and all the things that countries that follow the rules, the international law way, and having regard for people will do. And I understand that. I understand why. But our adversaries aren't going to wait. And we've already seen them, even before this, investing in breaking missile treaties, investing in new capabilities, UAVs. And so we have to be on the front foot as well.
Thank you, Secretary. Now, Minister Luik, what's your take?
Well, my main message would be international cooperation. As I said, it's very, very easy to say it, but the question is, what does it mean in terms of, let's say, epidemiological crisis? For instance, I think one of the challenges is that there are not enough credible international bodies who could be immediately giving advice to other countries. Let's say in spring, there was a huge health crisis related to COVID in Italy. If there would have been an international body who, looking at the Italian crisis, could have immediately given other countries some credible advice or some initial ideas at least, because I well understand that the Italian doctors had their hands full. They didn't have time to organize international efforts or international cooperation. I think that should be changed. For instance, EU, which prides itself by being very unified in its response, European Commission has a lot of tools, but in this instance, European Commission didn't have any tools. So I think this is something which is important. And on the other hand, as we have all said many times, we shouldn't forget that our adversaries are ready and they have capable conventional means to face us and to harass us. And I'm so proud that the military cooperation we are having is in such a deep, well-organized level. And I just use this opportunity to thank our British colleagues, Ben, the whole British government for providing an important deterrent, EFP, in Estonia, which is highly valued by Estonians and, of course, by NATO in general. And same goes to Canada being in Latvia. I mean, we are very proud of all of you who are here and who are really doing your best. And we are always ready to help wherever we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Such a good note to end on, but I'll probably tone it a little bit down with concluding that I think what we have from this panel, there's a good news within the bad news. And the good news is that defense has been able to deliver. It has been able to deliver both on a traditional front, keeping the deterrence high, being able to function along the traditional lines of responsibility, at the same time using the knowledge and understanding of a crisis, the capabilities for response, planning and others to help the society, to bring closer the notion of societal resilience. So that far is the good news. The bad news is the world that is going to emerge from this crisis is going to be much more unstable. And instability will be not only global or regional, that will likely also reflect within our own societies, because a number of things have been put into the motion that drives us apart rather than keeps us together, both internationally as well as within the national borders. So I'll end up with a very simple conclusion that I think we've all heard from all the ministers, and that is, alone we are weak, together we are strong. Thank you very much for joining. There's a short break, and then there'll be a next session of Riga conference. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.